We asked former US Congressman Ron Paul if he thinks the government is going to get better at dealing with the big challenges we face: the coronavirus pandemic, our massive national debt, and the newly announced global Great Reset initiative. Here's what he said.
I would say the odds of people coming to their senses in Washington, from my experience up there, are about 0-0.
Welcome to the Wealthion.com YouTube channel. I'm Wealthion founder Adam Taggart, and every week on this channel we will help you make sense of money and the markets by bringing you the world's top experts in investing, economics, and personal finance. Today we continue our inaugural series of daily interviews that we're calling Insights from the Masters of Wealth, this time featuring former U.S. Representative Dr. Ron Paul, in which he explains his concern that the government is recklessly driving us into crisis with its runaway borrowing and deficit spending. So right before we get to this interview, a quick ask for you. Since we're launching this brand new Wealthion YouTube channel, if you could help us out by just clicking subscribe below. Now with that said, let's hear from Dr. Ron Paul. It's my honor today to welcome Dr. Ron Paul to the program. Dr. Paul served as a Republican member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He also ran for the presidential nomination, first as a Libertarian and then later on as a Republican. And he did much of this while still serving as a practicing physician, delivering over 4,000 babies. Now, Dr. Paul's been a lifelong advocate of free market economics, a radical reduction in the size of government, privacy protection for individuals, and a reduction in U.S. foreign interventions. We're going to ask him about all of those questions here. But before we get started, Dr. Paul, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the program, and I'd like to start by saying it's wonderful to see you in good health.
Well, very good, and I'm very happy to be with you today.
Dr. Paul, let me start with the obvious, if I may. The coronavirus pandemic caught the world by surprise in 2020, and I'm going to ask you some questions about COVID and public health in just a few minutes, given your medical background. But before we get there, I just want to emphasize that the pandemic and government's response to it has exacerbated a number of the things that you've spent your career warning about: debt, deficit spending, easy monetary policy, and government overreach. So let's start with those. So looking at the U.S. national deficit, it's going to be over $3 trillion this year, which is a record by a huge amount. And they're still considering additional stimulus this year, so that number could go even higher. Continuing to look at our national addiction to debt, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the national debt is going to be over 100% of GDP in 2021. So my question for you, Dr. Paul, is this: are all of these emergency actions, stimulus programs, et cetera, emergency borrowing, deficits, is that actually necessary given the scope of the crisis that we're dealing with? Or are we perhaps creating a much bigger long-term crisis for ourselves given this short-term short-sightedness in response?
Well, it depends on what your goal is. It's very, very necessary if you want to keep it together under similar conditions that we have today for at least a few more months. In other words, the price is very high, and it won't continue. It's going to destroy the further future out there. And the whole thing is we don't know exactly when that'll happen. They're going to keep spending and printing and doing whatever they can to manufacture prosperity, which isn't even being achieved right now. There's a lot of money going out there, but the people aren't really getting economic growth again. Some people don't go back to work because the welfare benefits are so great, and that just can't last. So, but on the short run, now, if Trump hadn't pressured him and the Democrats hadn't pressured the Fed, about a year ago, because I think the economic correction from the bubble that the Fed created occurred before COVID. COVID complicated things. And both parties, they were there, and the Fed changed its tune after it was discovered the overnight rates back September of 18. The rates went up to 10%. The spigot was turned on, and it really made everybody happy, even though they did politicize it a bit. But I think that's doing it. At a person that's been on drugs, and they're having some symptoms because they're being weaned off drugs, or they've quit, or they missed it, and they can get pretty violent and sick and problems. that's the economy is going to get like that. So that's why, even though the right thing to do, people know what it is: quit spending, balance the budget, have sound money, give us a free country, and let us solve our own problem. But that's not going to happen because the medicine is too tough. The system can't hold it. But what they don't realize, and what the people should realize, is that if you don't take that treatment, the results will be more deadly than accepting the ramifications of living within our means. And that's where the real problem is. So I would say the odds of people coming to their senses in Washington, from my experience up there, are about 0-0, that they will all of a sudden have enough members of Congress to represent a more libertarian free market approach and quit this spending and living within our means. So we have to look forward, vaguely speaking, not in a positive way, anticipating that this thing is going to get much worse and nobody can understand exactly how it might turn out. But most of the time when a country gets into this much trouble, the final results are very, very bad.
I was hoping maybe there was a little bit more hope in the story than that, but 0.0 is a pretty definitive prediction there. And you've been there, you know the people that are in place, you know the institutions making the decisions. So I trust your estimates way better than mine. Dr. Paul, it sounds like you're saying, look, they're going to continue doing what they're doing just until the system breaks. At this point, do you think that it's going to break economically in a way that they just can't control at some point in time, or because of the huge wealth disparity that all of the intervention is creating, right? The spoils are going into the pockets of a smaller and smaller group of people that are kind of running the show, and everybody else is getting left behind. Do you fear sort of a social unrest element to this story?
I think that's the key thing to be concerned about, because I don't remember everything about the Depression, but a little bit about it because I was born in the 30s. And people were destitute and they were poor, but it was different, even different now, because I think there's more dependency, more anger, more demands, and more at stake, and that the discrepancy between the wealth in this country is worse than ever. And right now, the people who have the upper hand on this, which should scare everybody, is this fits into the scenario that the socialists and the Marxists and the communists, can use to argue the case for, well, see what happens with capitalism. So if we who believe in freedom can't convert more people to an understanding that what we're talking about today, the shortcomings, has nothing to do with freedom. It has to do with the opposite. It has to do with a system of corporatism, a pseudo-capitalism, and yet there's a lot of people in Washington still who believe it's it's because that we don't have enough spending and this sort of thing, and that is of course the reason why you hear more people willing to talk about socialism. But it's going to be up for grabs, and it's going to be very, very tough. But I think your question inquired whether or not there could turn into violence, and I think so. I think the violence is there already. I think when you look at what was happening in our streets, and we still see it today, that they tear up cities and steal and rob, and then they kick, and then they identify with the police, and the police don't help bring about order. So there's no respect for private property. And I think that's just the beginning, because the one that people have to remember is we do not create wealth by creating new money. But most people say, send me another check and we'll go back to work and create money. Turns out the people got X, and it was more than they were making in their job. So they're not going to go back to work, a lot of them. So this is, I think the violence should be something that we should be very concerned about. And a lot of people are planning for it, unfortunately, because it's only the change in philosophy and the belief in freedom and the responsibility of individuals to care for themselves that can prevent this from coming unglued.
All right, so let's pull on that thread just a little bit more. In terms of the hunger of the masses to take in the promises of those that are offering them I think it's understandable to think that the masses would say, look, if I'm getting shafted, I may as well get shafted and get something. So the guy who's promising me free healthcare, debt forgiveness, whatever, I'm going to vote for that guy. The pandemic has served as an accelerator for sort of a new concept that's being put forth at the global level. World governments, world NGOs like the World Economic Forum and the IMF, in many major developed countries have now been putting forward this concept called the Great Reset. And I just want to very quickly, for those folks that aren't familiar with it, just give its quick tenets. It says it targets a redefinition of capitalism, and this is what you were just getting to, Dr. Paul. Their three main pillars are: they want to steer the market towards fairer outcomes, and that's very interesting because who determines what's fair if the market's not determining what's fair? And they plan to use taxes and regulations to do that. They are looking to increase economic stimulus spending that focuses on equality and sustainability. So these are things like green infrastructure projects and whatnot. And then the last is to harness innovation to address health and social challenges, very much in the way the world is marshaling to fight COVID. They want to marshal the world's resources to target things like public health and social challenges. And on the surface, that doesn't sound so bad, but given your experience as a US Congressman, as an economic hawk, and as a defender of personal freedoms, what's your reaction to this?
Not a chance in the world that this reset has something positive about it. Reset sounds like pretty good. Well, we'll reassess things and do the right thing. But everything they're talking about is just doing more of it. It's like this modern monetary theory. Oh, what we ought to do is just print more money and pass it out, and that'll solve the problem. No, I think resetting is just the anticipation that we should have anticipated, and that we're having it more and more. The longer the system that we have lasts, the more it demands. You need bigger deficits, and you need more government intrusion. We need more regulation. And what they're talking about is not a solution. The only thing that is a solution is returning to an understanding of what free people can do for themselves. And it isn't like it. I know the odds that I gave were pretty slim, and for now I think that they're correct. But it doesn't mean it has to be that way, because one of the most memorable times in my lifetime, and that's not that long ago, was 1989 and 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet system. I thought that was the most fantastic thing in the world. But it wasn't so much that the grassroots understood von Mises, but they did understand that communism was a total failure. And they just walked away from it. What was amazing was that, and I was drafted in the 60s during the Cold War and the missiles in Cuba and this sort of thing. So they were ready to do that, but all of a sudden there was no exchange of weapons. It just collapsed. Things did get somewhat better. There was a freedom. There was a dividend. But it was all a facade, because it was not so much going to liberty, but it was going to economic interventionism, the Keynesian approach, which some people accepted as a substitute for communism. Well, it was better, but the thing of it is, the point I'm making is, it wasn't the whole answer, it was a part of an answer, and it happened without the total annihilation of millions of people like had been occurring so often. But I thought that's what we need. We need to change. But instead of going back and saying, well, we can modify Keynesianism and we just need better people at the Federal Reserve, we can solve this problem. No, we need a changed attitude among the people to understand why their best interests are only going to occur when we live in a free society, which emphasizes the responsibility of each and every individual to take care of themselves, and that they have this responsibility. And of course, they have the benefits too. They own their own life, and they just have to have one rule: don't lie, cheat, or steal. And things would get better. But back to my assessment, we don't have enough yet, but we have a growing number of people. A program like yours, Adam, is one that gets information out that talks about these things. So there's a lot of people out there, and we're going to come to this climactic end. And maybe the question should be, could we have a transition like in 88, 89, and 90 to something more peaceful? And then we participate in what a free society is all about. So I remain optimistic on that, but very pessimistic on expecting Congress in the next year or two or in a Biden administration to all of a sudden, shift gears. It's going to get worse before it gets better.
All right. All right. So switching then from civil liberties for a second to the economy, and that's something that we spend a lot of time talking about here at Peak Prosperity as well. And Dr. Paul, I know you've been, again, one of the more vocal advocates for better economic policies that bring us into better alignment, both with living in our means and also increasing, fairness, sound money, et cetera. So just real quickly, we're looking at an economy here that was, as you said earlier, it was actually struggling pre-COVID. Then it got basically a massive gut shot from the pandemic and the lockdowns that came along with it. And what's interesting is the economy is still really struggling to get out of that hole, and yet we have asset prices back up to record all-time high levels of valuations. By many metrics, the most richly valued they've ever been in all of history. And I'm just curious, as you look forward, do you have a strong sense of how this is going to end up? Will history repeat and we'll get some big corrective crash here? Or are we at the point potentially where the floodgates have been opened so wide that it's just runaway prices from here?
It's going to end up with a crack-up boom, and that's what Mises talked about. And I think that's what we're seeing in some of these areas like the stocks and the bonds. Just think of the bonds, 0%, and it's probably below zero if you talk about real interest rates.
Real rates, yeah.
I mean, that is just huge. And I think people don't talk about the bond market and debt because that's all we have to offer is more debt and more printing of money. And that's why, that is going to be the dilemma. In the 70s, we had something interesting happening. We had like an invisible crash. Prices were going up and they were taking away all the profits. At the same time, there was a slump where, it was a depression, but there was a price inflation. Right now, we live with people in Washington that the only thing that represents growth in the economy, they pretend it's just printing more money. But what they're saying is the only way you have growth in the economy is if you have inflation. So here we have been working for years now. If we could only get prices to go up and stick it to the people at about 2 or 3% a year, that we'll get over this. Well, prices are going up a lot faster than that for a lot of people. And I think that is going to happen. That's where the liquidation comes. The liquidation of the debt and the malinvestment has to occur if we ever want to get back to real growth. And the liquidation usually occurs with governments with liquidating the value of the money, because what I was implying before, it's not going to be liquidated by people working hard, sending more money to the government and paying down the debt and the spending, backs off. That is not going to happen. So the liquidation is going to come with high price inflation, devaluing. But I see that the devaluation will be in the currency. And I think we see a little bit of that now. The dollar is not quite as strong as it was maybe 6 months ago. And I think there's going to be a lot more than that. And the crack up boom, you can't predict. And that's the one thing about Austrian economics. They can print money, but they never know where it goes. So yes, they printed tons of it, trillions of it. And yet the consumer price index hasn't gone up. So people, how can this be? We don't have any inflation. What they're doing is just saying, well, we don't see inflation. We can keep printing more money. And guess who supports it? There's two groups of people there, Republicans and Democrats, because none of them, no, I shouldn't say none. There are very, very few willing to attack the source of all this, the financing, the sinister financing that creates this imbalance in wealth, and that is the Federal Reserve System and the deficit financing.
On that topic of sort of the diminishment of the purchasing power of the currency through all of this money printing, you've been a past outspoken advocate for precious metals, and I'm curious, now that the Fed has essentially doubled its balance sheet in the past year, has your opinion on them changed, and do you have an opinion on the cryptocurrencies as well?
Well, no, I think printing money, eventually causes a great deal of harm because, it distorts interest rates. It destroys the most important price there is, and that is the price of money. And that's why economic growth crumbles. And history is on the side of saying that precious metals seem to, hold up the best to preserve wealth, even though I think it does, and I endorse that principle. But really, the only thing that really protects us is our liberty, and the shrinkage of government. But in the meantime, if you're looking to try to survive, the metals are very good. And a lot of people, and I speak at the cryptocurrencies and the Bitcoin conferences, except when this lockdown came, and I don't get on airplanes at the present time. But I speak there, although I am not, a cheerleader. I see one of the things about gold, it's lasted for a long time and has served a purpose. But even gold, what good is it if you don't have your liberties? Just think, for 42 years or so, ever since 1933, we weren't even allowed to own gold until 1975. So it's that relationship, it's our freedoms that really count. So my goal in office is to help get gold legalized again and make sure people can use it and as a haven. And as far as the cryptocurrencies go, I introduced legislation which would be to permit competing currencies and get rid of illegal tender laws, because governments want control and they have to control it. So that is a concern that I have with cryptocurrencies, because it looks like a lot of people are voting for cryptocurrencies right now. And if they're looking at it only in the dollar crypto exchange, I can say, well, we're doing very, very well. But I think that the governments are always wanting control, always in the monetary system. And the more crypto is accepted as money, the more controls there would be. Of course, you say, well, it's anonymous and there's transparency. But I read the stories. I talk to individuals who have been hit at the exchanges because they didn't pay enough taxes on this. And that bothers me, but I don't like to pay taxes on anything. But there's no perfect transition into accepting cryptocurrencies, and everybody's going to be happy about it. But my goal is to keep them legal and minimize the opportunity for governments to come in and dictate to how they must use. Because one of the goals of the way I understand, one of the goals of the cryptocurrency is to avoid too many reports and to avoid going through the banking system, this sort of thing. But I find it fascinating. I think the technology is very interesting. I think blockchain technology has a lot of benefits, but I don't think the final word is in for cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin as being money as beneficial and useful as the precious metals.
Great. I think very similarly to you personally, Dr. Paul. I do want to ask you this question because this is such an interesting topic to me. The Treasury is allergic to competition when it comes to, the guy who's printing, minting coins in his garage, right? They'll throw you in prison for that. And it has somewhat flummoxed me that they've allowed the cryptocurrency community to flourish as much as it has. And one line of thought might be, well, they're just letting them kind of figure the model out, and then at some point the government will step in with a Fed coin or a digital dollar or whatever it is. What is the likelihood that you see, and we've even heard some talk this year about the central banks issuing their own digital currencies. What do you really see as the likelihood of the government making it harder and harder to own these cryptocurrencies once it has its own product out there?
Well, that's the nature of government. Governments will do it if they remain the size it is now, and it keeps expanding. If you had a proper sized government in a republic, you wouldn't have to worry about it. But I can remember I believe the Federal Reserve chairman that was before our committee was Bernanke at the time when crypto was coming up as a subject, and I asked the question, about what is his opinion about it, and it was more, just to see if what I could find out. And I was sort of surprised about the answer, because the the answer wasn't real. It wasn't critical of the concept. It wasn't endorsing it, but it wasn't condemning it. And I thought they are keeping a close eye on that, and they know exactly what's going on. But I think all authoritarian governments control the money, whether it's gold, whether it's cryptocurrency, whether it's cattle or any other substitute people might, whether they want to control wealth. And that, of course, is what the real authoritarians, whether the Marxists or the fascists, they control wealth. But right now, most people in Washington, they want to control wealth because they use it as a political tool to pass out the wealth, and they get reelected and they're powerful, and then they have their own wealth to enjoy.
All right. Well, look, Dr. Paul, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to end with this one last question. As a doctor, I'm just curious for your personal perspective on handling of COVID. You have this challenge if you're running a country, and I get it, right, where you are trying to maintain the balance of keeping your economy running while not allowing so many people to contract the virus such that you're overwhelming your healthcare system. Do you have a perspective on what you think is the right approach for handling a national challenge like this?
The danger of the virus is blown way out of proportion, but it's serious and it should be dealt with. And that's why you don't want Fauci being the king and the dictator, and a Bill Gates who has ulterior motive. They shouldn't be dictators that tell us what to do. I'm a strong believer in natural, immune systems, the vitamin approach to it. And I think that this is much better than to expect the press to solve the problems. Just right now, we talk a lot about that on my Live Report, and now they're coming up. Today I came across an article where they have. I think it's occurring in Great Britain. They have two vaccines that they're dealing with. Well, this one's pretty good and this one's pretty good. I think what we ought to do is start in January to have this experiment. Let's put them together and test them. And these things are experimental. They're using RNA instead of DNA. They've never done it before. And they've had some catastrophic problems with vaccine. Now, does that mean we shouldn't have vaccines? No, it should be done voluntarily. People should have choices. This whole idea that people won't have a choice, and they're talking about right now, that is a real concern of mine, is that to have the passport injected in your arm, you won't go anywhere without your passport. But that is coming if we don't reverse this trend, because governments want to know exactly what we're doing. So I don't see any advantage other than no advantage from what they have done with the government has done with the dealing with the virus. Once again, it isn't that the virus doesn't have some danger, but that's the reason you don't want the government doing it, because they can take a minor danger and make it 10 times worse. And believe me, they took a recession, depression that was on its way, and now they've made it much, much worse. And it's not going to end easily, because nobody can be against this thing, for the vaccine. So that's the sad part. People have to think about living in a free society where people have a responsibility for themselves, and they have the ability to keep what they earn, and that it's their life. And you say, oh, no, think of all the things that the government does good for us. Well, I could list a few things I think the government does harm to it. The government is the greatest threat to our civil liberties, not your next door neighbor, because I think your neighborhoods can be pretty well protected by the Second Amendment and just getting along with people. We need more of that.
Well, thank you for that, Dr. Paul. You remind me of my favorite demotivational poster, which says, "Government, if you don't like the problems we create, just wait till you see our solutions."
Oh boy, that's pretty good.
Well, anyways, Dr. Paul, thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise and your perspective with us. Thank you again for your championship of all of the elements that we talked about today, from personal liberties to economic freedoms, et cetera. For people who are interested in continuing to follow you and learn more about you and your work, where should they go?
Well, the best thing to do, because I do this almost every single day, at least 5 days a week, is the Ron Paul Liberty Report. And we live stream a program, 11 o'clock Central Time. And it's usually 25 to 30 minutes, and it's a pretty relaxed program. And we do a lot of foreign policy. Actually, it started that way, but lately it's been a lot on civil liberty and COVID and what's happening with the economy.
Great. Well, Dr. Paul, we'll put up an overlay showing that URL to your folks, so they can go check out your daily work. And folks, as a reminder, if you want to know who we're having as upcoming guests in this program, just follow me on Twitter at @MenloBear. But Dr. Paul, thank you so much again. Really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to share your expertise. And we hope to have you on at some point in 2021 to see what's happening at that point.
Very good. Nice being with you today.
A real pleasure. Thank you.